So I think we might be starting to see a common thread here, which is that there's generally some kind of insult at the heart of each dumb thing people say to atheists. The phrase, "it takes more faith to be an atheist than to be a Christian," is clearly not meant to extol the virtues of faith, but instead accuses atheists of being credulous and going out of their way to avoid acknowledging God. The "you have no reason not to rape one," while not saying any specific atheist wants to rape, implies we lack a broad moral concern about the act, thus painting us as callous toward the victims and dangerous to society. But at least they are somewhat roundabout insults. The person who says them isn't necessarily directing them at you personally, but is arguably just lumping you in with a broader mindset that you may or may not be totally conscious of or responsible for. With this next one, though, there's no such beating around the bush, as theists just dive straight in and accuse you of conscious ill intent based on a lack of desire to be a good person. And not only that, but they tell you that your entire position is built on nothing but this conscious ill intent. And this statement, of course, is 1, 2, 3, all together now. You're only an atheist because you want to sin. In other words, the only reason you can disagree with me is that you're a shitty person. Classy. So the idea, of course, is that atheists don't sincerely disbelieve in God based on lack of evidence, but instead know in their hearts that he exists, but pretend he doesn't so they can act however they want. This video will address this statement from two angles. First, the nature of this insult and what it means to conversation between believers and unbelievers, and second, whether the idea behind this statement even makes sense. Speaking to the first point, this is obviously a willful, direct dig against a person's character. One that can only serve to stop conversation in its tracks. Whether it's worded as, "you just want to sin," "you don't want an authority over you," or whatever else, nothing good will come from this kind of insulting nonsense, and I can only see both sides walking away more disconnected than when they started. The atheist feeling nothing but insulted by the theist feeling justified by their artificial sense of superiority, and neither any closer to an understanding of the other person's position. So why do Christians say such things? Again, I want to be cautious about the whys here. While I think there's typically going to be some crass intent to belittle you and assert moral superiority, we need to remember that there can be more to it than that. This is explored in a video called "How Christianity Makes Conversation Impossible," in which I explain this about Christians. It is very difficult, if not impossible, for them to assume numbers 1 and 2 about people who substantially disagree with them. Why? Well, first and most obviously, their holy book talks a lot of really ugly shit about non-believers. So if their ultimate source of truth is telling Christians that we've purposefully rejected God out of a knowing desire to sin, what else are they supposed to think? But there's also a second reason, one that probably runs a little deeper for most of them. Whereas secular people think we're left to our own devices to figure out as much truth as we can, and are thus prone to honest error, Christians believe we get divine guidance from a God who loves us, wants us to know the truth, and is perfectly capable of conveying the truth. This means that if a Christian is to see a non-believer as sincerely mistaken, he or she must assume that God failed to offer this guidance, and even worse, that God will punish the person with eternal torment for arriving at honestly mistaken conclusions, and a Christian simply can't view their perfect and loving God this way. What's more, we need to remember that Christians who say the "you just want to sin" thing are often in the midst of learning that a person they love no longer holds their cherished beliefs, and that can be seriously distressing. But the fact still remains that this does not legitimize or excuse the kinds of insults we're talking about. Everybody experiences disappointments when people in their lives fail to live up to their expectations. Sometimes this can be difficult to cope with, and not just for Christians. But we all need to take responsibility for how we speak to others, because assuming this kind of thing about another person is just disrespectful bullshit. And if we all went around tossing out this level of insult, we would live in a very rude society indeed. And yes, This means that if you're an atheist who tells Christians that they hold to their religion because they're self-righteous, want easy answers, or can't cope with the reality of death, then stop it. Seriously, because you're doing the exact same thing. But then what if Christians just feel pinched between the justice of God and the sincerity of atheists? Should this give them a pass? I say no for a couple reasons. First, we do need to take some responsibility for what we let ourselves believe. If you're an adult of sound mind in a religion that pushes you to disparage everybody outside your religion, it's on you to recognize that you're being manipulated with cult-like tactics of isolation. And if you let this impact your relationship with others, it's kind of your fault. Second, even if you indulge your religion's demand to believe things about other people, you can still control how you act based on that belief. Part of living in a pluralistic society is being polite enough not to blurt out every negative thing you believe about others, and to find the right conversational context to tactfully and fruitfully air out your differences with them. If Christians consider themselves the exception to this rule, then they are choosing to withdraw from the broader conversation, and they shouldn't get to complain if they start to feel isolated from those around them. So in short, I would encourage you to try to understand what prompts Christians to say this, but recognize that this is still unacceptable conversational behavior. But all that said, does this accusation even make sense? I posited this question in one of my old cartoons called Denying God in Your Heart. But if his existence were really that obvious, then would any sane person ever just pretend they didn't believe in him?
Hey, did you know there's a God?
No.
Well, there is one.
Really? Where is he?
Right behind you.
Oh,
See? His existence is so obvious that you have no excuse but to believe in him and obey him.
obey who?
The giant deity who's standing right behind you.
There's no deity behind me.
I'm right here.
Clearly, the idea that a person would pretend not to believe in God when he's right there is simply nonsensical. Of course, Christians might say this cartoon doesn't fairly represent the situation, since God doesn't appear before our eyes, but the physicality of God's form is irrelevant. When Christians assert God's existence is obvious to everybody and atheists just pretend he's not there, they're painting a picture that's as silly as what we see in this cartoon. The only alternative is that God's existence isn't obvious to atheists. But the most implausible part comes when we get to the motivation for pretending God doesn't exist. Later in this cartoon, the character watches God send a person to hell, and his friend implores him to accept God's existence.
For real, man. I'm sending someone to hell right now. Look, you can see it happening right over there.
Didn't you see that? Come to your senses, man. Do you want to end up going to hell the way that guy just did?
Steady, man, steady. If I keep pretending I don't see this, then I can stick with my master plan of sinning for a while and burning in hell for all eternity after that. No, I didn't see anything.
And this is seriously what Christians are proposing we're doing. They're saying that with full knowledge that God exists, we're pretending to ignore him just so we can behave for a few years on earth before burning for eternity in hell. Whether they think we do this somewhat consciously or are engaging in the poorly defined activity of suppressing knowledge of him in our hearts, the whole thing just doesn't make sense. Sure, a few outlying people with a crippling lack of impulse control might make this kind of decision, but would we really find so many people making this choice? And would the choice fall so neatly along cultural and social lines? Would people like scientists, for example, along with the populations of Sweden and China, exhibit such high rates of impulsivity that they'd act out knowing it meant hell, while people with more developed self-control tend to be found in the American Deep South? It sounds pretty f***ing unlikely to me. But there's a whole other question we have to consider, and that is, if a person wanted to sin, would flipping God the bird and turning atheist be the smartest way to go about it? Anybody who thinks this is the case has totally failed to consider what the process of becoming an atheist looks like. When coming out as an atheist, a person risks cutting themselves off from familiar circles of friends and even from social safety nets that they rely on for support. They give up comforting routines along with a huge part of their personal and cultural identity and have to start a very uncomfortable process of understanding who they are apart from their religion. In a way, the resolve needed to publicly adopt the atheist label is similar to that needed to get a divorce, due to all the awkwardness it creates and the ways it forces you to restructure your life. There can be a sense of relief in becoming honest and true to who you really are, But it is not a fun process, and certainly not something most people would go through because they wanted to sin. In fact, if you were a Christian and you did want to sin, think of all the other options you might have at your disposal. Of course, you could always keep sinning and asking God for forgiveness, right? In fact, I know several Christians who behave far more wildly and irresponsibly than I ever have, and dealing with this is a simple matter of praying to God, then publicly telling everybody how sorry you are and how you're now choosing to walk in obedience. The social price for this is relatively negligible, and quite to the contrary, people tend to fawn all over these prodigal sons every time they return. But even if the Christians around you do get tired of your bullshit, you can always find a new church that either isn't familiar with your persistent recidivism or takes a more liberal stand toward your specific sin. In short, for every non-criminal sin you could ever want to commit, there's some Christian environment out there in which you can comfortably commit it. So why would anybody upend their lives, take on the role of a social pariah, and go to hell for the sake of an atheist label they don't even believe in, when there are much easier ways to sin and still go to heaven? It doesn't make sense. There's one last part to this, and that is that denying God does not remove you from under authority. I explore this in my first ever cartoon, which opens with a character saying, "Boy, I sure am glad I decided to become an atheist. Now that I've denied God in my heart, I can act however I want with no accountability. Boy, this is going to be great. So what should I do with my newfound freedom? Well, I certainly would like some more money. So I guess the first thing I should do is go rob a bank. But no, that's illegal, and I'd probably end up getting sent to prison." He runs through a variety of bad behaviors and one at a time realizes that social constraints and human institutions will keep him from committing them. Then, in the end, he finally ponders why he should engage in small acts of helpfulness and consideration toward others. Nobody's going to reward or punish me for this stuff either way, right? So why should I bother if God's not watching? Except, well, you always pay a social price for that kind of behavior, and I'm probably better off doing my part to fit in with polite society. Besides, do I really want to be that kind of asshole? When I think about it, I'm more accountable to people than I ever was to God. I guess being an atheist isn't going to be as much fun as I thought after all. I think this is the problem anybody would run into if they thought becoming an atheist would let them act however they wanted. Because all of us, Christian and atheist alike, are restrained more by social and legal pressures than by whatever commands we imagine God gives us. So if anyone tells you you're choosing atheism so you can sin, here are a few things you can calmly and politely tell them. 1. They're offering a pointless insult that basically ends conversation with you. 2. The idea that anybody would pretend they don't believe in God just to sin for a while is not only insulting but nonsensical. And this is the big one. Does anybody really think I would go through my life knowing I will suffer an eternity of torment for how I'm living, yet not take such minimal effort as asking for forgiveness and identifying as a Christian to fix the problem? 3. Even if a person does want to sin, they can easily satisfy that desire while remaining Christian. And finally, 4. We're more accountable to other people than to God anyway. At any rate, I've gone on longer than usual, and I don't think there's much more to add in conclusion. I'm going to continue with this series, but that'll be after breaking things up a bit in the next couple weeks. I'm working on a video about how God's Not Dead sanitizes Christianity, as well as my next Bible cartoon about the flood, so keep your eyes out for those. And of course a big thanks to my patrons, including Council of Zod members SR Foxley and Q. As we approach the end of another month, I'm getting ready for the next drawing, so if you're on the Army of Zod level or higher, please update a mailing address so I can send you something if you win. I've had trouble getting verification from drawing winners and I'm dying to send people stuff. If you want to join this list of fine patrons, please find the link below, as well as links to Twitter, Facebook, and my email. Thank you, and Zod bless Krypton.